The stagecoach rattled across the wide Wyoming plain, its wheels cutting through dust like a tired sigh from the earth itself. Clara Jennings sat by the window, holding her little boy close, his head resting on her lap. The child was asleep, his dark lashes trembling against cheeks too thin for a boy of 5. The sight of him, her Samuel, made her chest ache in that old familiar way, a blend of fierce love and fear of the uncertain road ahead. She brushed a lock of his hair from his forehead and turned her gaze outward, where the horizon stretched in endless amber folds beneath a sky as wide as forever. Somewhere out there, past the river and the cottonwoods, waited the man she had agreed to work for, a cattle rancher by the name of Eli McCall. A man the townsfolk in Cheyenne had called the Giant. They'd spoken the name with equal measures of awe and respect, some with a touch of fear. But Clara had no room left for fear, not after burying her husband in Missouri, not after scraping through 2 winters sewing for other people's children while her own went hungry. All she had left was courage and Samuel. Always Samuel. She had written to McCall in response to a notice tacked to the church post in town. Help wanted, it had said. Housekeeper needed for a working ranch. Must be honest and willing. Room and board provided. It was signed in a steady, firm hand. There had been no mention of whether he was young or old, widowed or alone, kind or cruel. But the Reverend's wife, who'd once met him at a cattle auction, had whispered, "He's a man who keeps to himself, Miss Jennings. Big as a bear but quiet. Lost his whole family to fever some years back. Lives out there with only his horses and his men." Clara had folded the paper and pressed it to her heart that night, praying it might be the beginning of safety. She'd written him a careful letter, explaining her need for work and her skill with keeping house and mending. She had not mentioned Samuel until the end. "I do have a son, sir. 5 years old, good and quiet. If you would not allow him, I understand." She never expected him to answer, but he had. Just one line in his rough script. "If you can cook and keep a home, bring the boy. I don't turn away kin." The wind howled through the coach windows and Clara wrapped her shawl tighter, drawing Samuel nearer. She could still recall her husband's voice, gentle, low, calling her darlin'. He'd been a schoolteacher, soft-spoken and kind, not made for hard labor or wild country. The fever had taken him fast, left her alone in a town where widows were pitied at first and forgotten soon after. When the rent came due and the work ran thin, she'd packed what little she owned and stepped onto the road west, toward a man she'd never met and a place she could only imagine. The driver called out over the noise of the horses, "Next stop, McCall Ranch." Clara's heart jolted. She looked out again. The land had changed, rising into gentle slopes dotted with sagebrush and long fences stretching toward the mountains. Cattle grazed like moving shadows beneath the dying light. And there, just beyond the ridge, she saw it, a great house of weathered timber with smoke curling from its chimney, sturdy and still against the wind. Her breath caught. Home, she thought, though she didn't yet believe the word. When the coach stopped, she stepped down, her boots sinking into the red dust. The air smelled of pine and smoke, a far cry from the damp alleys of Missouri. Samuel stirred and reached for her hand, blinking in confusion. "Mama, where are we?" he whispered. "Someplace better, sweetheart," she murmured. The driver unloaded her trunk, tipped his hat, and left her standing in the yard with the child in the cold wind. For a long moment she wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. Then a door creaked open across the yard. A man stepped out onto the porch. Eli McCall filled the doorway like a mountain come to life. Broad shoulders, rough shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, chest dusted with work, and eyes the color of the stormy sky. He wasn't handsome in the way of town men. No, his face was too stern for that. But there was something carved and noble about it, like the stone faces in church windows that could withstand centuries. He descended the porch steps slow, each one deliberate. Samuel's small hand tightened around hers. Clara tried to steady her voice. "Mr. McCall?" she called softly. He nodded once, stopped a few feet away, and took her in with a gaze that saw too much. "Mrs. Jennings?" he asked, and his voice rumbled deep, almost kind beneath the gravel. She nodded. "Aye, sir. Thank you for taking us in." For a long breath he said nothing. His gaze drifted to the boy clutching her skirts. Then something softened in the lines of his face. He crouched, resting his large hand on his knee so he was eye level with Samuel. "You got a strong grip on your mama there," he said quietly. The boy nodded. Eli gave a faint, almost shy smile. "Good. A man ought to take care of what's his." He rose to his full height again and turned toward the house. "There's stew on the stove," he said simply. "You look like you both need it." Clara hesitated, watching him stride ahead, his gait heavy but sure, the sunset framing his figure in molten gold. She whispered under her breath, "Thank you, Lord," and led Samuel inside. The warmth of the ranch house hit her like an embrace. The smell of bread, smoke, and leather filled the room. There was order here, everything in its place, neat, clean, simple. On the mantel hung an old photograph of a woman and two small girls, their faces fading with time. Clara's heart ached at the sight. This was a house that had known love and loss. She removed her shawl and guided Samuel to a seat by the hearth. Eli returned from the kitchen with two bowls and placed them before them, his big hands careful not to clatter. "Eat," he said, not as an order but as something close to concern. Clara murmured thanks, her voice catching. She hadn't eaten hot food in 2 days. Samuel dug in, his small spoon clinking. Eli leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching the flames. After a while he spoke again, low and thoughtful. "Tomorrow I'll show you the rooms upstairs. You can take the east one. Morning light comes through there." His tone was practical, but there was a gentleness beneath it. She nodded, unsure how to answer. That night, when Samuel was asleep, Clara stood by the window, staring at the open land bathed in silver moonlight. Somewhere outside she could hear Eli's deep voice talking to the horses in the barn, steady and patient. The sound calmed her in ways she couldn't explain. For the first time in months she felt safe. Yet beneath that peace stirred something new, something she didn't dare name. As the wind whispered across the prairie, Clara Jennings closed her eyes and let herself breathe. Morning came pale and quiet over the McCall ranch, spilling soft gold through the window of the small east room. Clara woke to the sound of roosters crowing and wind brushing against the shutters. For a moment she didn't know where she was. Then the smell of wood smoke and the faint murmur of cattle brought her back. Samuel was still asleep beside her, his little hand curled near her arm, his breathing steady. She smiled faintly and rose, careful not to wake him. The room was simple but clean. Whitewashed walls, a handmade quilt, a small dresser that looked like it had been crafted by a man's patient hands long ago. There was kindness in the details of this place. She dressed quietly, twisted her hair up, and went downstairs. The kitchen was warm already. Eli was there, sitting at the big wooden table with a cup of coffee steaming before him. Morning light caught the side of his face, tracing the sharp line of his jaw. He glanced up when she entered, his expression unreadable. "Mornin', Mrs. Jennings," he said in that low, calm voice of his. "Sleep all right?" She nodded, smoothing her skirts. "Yes, thank you. It's been a long time since I slept in a real bed." He gave a small nod and motioned toward the counter. "There's bread, and I kept the fire going. If you want to fix breakfast, I'll be out checking the herd." Then, after a pause, "The boy can come with me if he likes. Fresh air'll do him good." She blinked in surprise. He won't be in the way?" Eli's gaze met hers, steady as ever. "He's part of you, ain't he? That makes him part of this place now." The words struck her deep, quiet as they were. She watched him pull on his hat, sunlight glinting off the rough gold of his hair, and for a moment she forgot to breathe. After he left, she moved through the kitchen with a calm she hadn't felt in months. There was something healing about the rhythm of work. The crackle of fire, the scent of flour and butter, the sound of the clock ticking on the wall. She made biscuits, fried eggs, and bacon, humming softly under her breath. When Samuel came down, rubbing his eyes, she kissed his cheek and said, "Mr. McCall says you can help him today." The boy's eyes lit up, a spark she hadn't seen since before his father's death. "Can I, Mama?" he asked eagerly. "Yes, sweetheart, be polite. Listen to him." She brushed his hair back and smiled. A moment later, she watched from the window as her son followed Eli out to the corral, his small boots leaving tiny prints beside the cowboy's broad ones. Eli moved like a man made for this land, sure-footed, unhurried, but strong in every motion. Samuel trailed him, eyes wide with wonder, and when Eli lifted him up to sit on the fence rail, the boy laughed out loud. That sound, it carried across the yard like a bell, bright and sweet, cutting straight through the quiet ache in Clara's chest. She pressed her hand to the window pane, watching them. Eli said something that made Samuel nod earnestly, his tiny hand clutching the post beside him. They looked right somehow, like two pieces of something that had been waiting to fit together. By midday, Clara had finished her chores and stepped out into the yard. The wind had softened, carrying the smell of sage and horses. Eli was working near the barn, mending a fence, his shirt sleeves rolled up and his forearms dusted with sunlight. Samuel was sitting nearby, holding nails in a small tin pail, utterly serious about his task. Clara stood for a moment, uncertain whether to speak, then called gently, "Would you like some water, Mr. McCall?" He looked up, squinting against the sun, and gave a nod. "Much obliged, ma'am." She crossed the yard, her skirt brushing against the grass, and handed him a tin cup. As he drank, she noticed the scar running along his forearm, a pale line like a story untold. "You work hard," she murmured. "Always did," he replied simply, setting down the cup. "Ranch don't run itself." His gaze flicked toward Samuel. "Boy's got good hands. Learns quick." The pride in his voice was quiet but genuine. It warmed her in a way that startled her. As days turned into weeks, the rhythm of their lives began to intertwine. Clara cleaned, cooked, mended, and tended the garden. Eli worked the land and the herds. Samuel followed him everywhere he was allowed. The boy adored him, brought him tools, fetched water, and listened wide-eyed to every word Eli spoke. Sometimes Clara would watch them from the porch at dusk, the giant cowboy and the little boy sitting on the fence watching the sun bleed into the mountains. She'd hear Samuel's laughter and Eli's low rumble of a chuckle, and her heart would swell with something she hadn't felt in a long time: belonging. It wasn't just Samuel who grew under Eli's quiet care. Clara did too. In the evenings, after the work was done and the stars came out, she would sit by the fire sewing while Eli read from an old Bible or polished his rifle. The silence between them was never heavy. It felt safe. Sometimes he'd ask about Missouri, about her late husband, and she'd tell him pieces of her story in that slow, careful way of a woman who had learned to hide her pain. He never pried. He just listened, his gaze steady, his hands folded loosely on his knees. And once, when she'd spoken of how hard it had been to keep Samuel fed that last winter, she saw something flicker in his eyes, something fierce and protective, like a storm he was holding back. The first time Eli smiled at her, truly smiled, was over supper one night. Samuel had made a mess trying to pour milk, and the boy's face had gone red with embarrassment. Clara had reached for a cloth, murmuring comfort, but Eli had only chuckled, that deep, slow laugh that seemed to start in his chest. "Don't fret, little man," he'd said, ruffling Samuel's hair. "Spilled milk just means you're trying to help." Clara had looked up then and caught his gaze, and the warmth in it stole her breath. For one long heartbeat, the world seemed to still. The fire crackled. Samuel giggled, and Eli McCall smiled at her like he'd just found something he hadn't known he was missing. One late afternoon, a storm rolled in, sudden and wild. The wind howled, thunder cracked over the plains, and the horses grew restless. Clara rushed to bring in the laundry while Eli and his men secured the barn. Rain drenched the earth in minutes, drumming against the windows. Samuel clung to her skirts, frightened by the thunder. Then came Eli's voice through the downpour, calling from the doorway. "You two all right?" He was soaked through, his hair dripping, but his concern was plain. "We're fine," she called back. He stepped inside, shaking off his coat, and for a moment the sight of him, tall, wet, every inch the protector, made her pulse race. Their eyes met across the room, lightning flashing behind him. "Storm'll pass," he said softly. "They always do." She nodded, though her breath caught, because she wasn't sure he meant the weather at all. That night, after the storm had quieted and Samuel slept safe in his bed, Clara found herself standing by the fire, staring at the orange glow. Eli was nearby, drying his hair with a towel, his shirt clinging to his broad frame. When he spoke, his voice was gentler than she'd ever heard it. "You're doing good work here, Clara. The house feels alive again." She turned toward him, her cheeks flushing. "That's kind of you to say." He hesitated, then stepped closer. The space between them felt like something fragile, sacred. "Don't thank me," he murmured. "You and the boy, you belong here." His words sank into her heart like roots taking hold. She couldn't speak. She only nodded, her eyes glistening as thunder rumbled one last time in the distance. Summer stretched wide and golden over the Wyoming plains. The grass grew tall. The air shimmered with heat, and the scent of wild sage filled every breath. By then, Clara had grown used to the rhythm of the ranch, the creak of the windmill, the lowing of cattle at dawn, the way Eli's voice carried when he called the men in from the fields. Samuel was thriving. His cheeks had filled out. His laughter echoed through the house like sunlight spilling into dark corners. Every evening he came home dusty and grinning, chattering about horses and saddles and how Mr. McCall had promised to teach him to ride. Watching them together, Clara sometimes felt tears sting her eyes. She'd feared her son would grow up without a man to guide him. But Eli filled that space without ever needing to say he meant to. The days were long, but they were good. Clara found herself humming as she worked, the old song she'd once sung when her life had been soft and certain. Sometimes Eli would come in from the fields, his boots heavy with dust, and she'd hand him a glass of cold water. Their fingers would brush, and the smallest touch would send a strange warmth through her chest. There was no courtship here, no flirtation in the way of young folk. But there was something steadier, truer, born from shared silence, from small acts of care. Once, when she sliced her hand on a broken plate, he'd taken her wrist gently in his big hand and cleaned the wound himself, his touch so careful it made her eyes sting. "You ought to take more care," he murmured. She had looked up at him then, her heart racing, and whispered, "I've forgotten what it feels like to have someone worry over me." He'd held her gaze for a long moment before answering softly, "Then you remember it now." It was late one afternoon when Clara found herself in the barn, folding linens to store in the loft. The air was thick with hay and sunbeams. She could hear Samuel outside with one of the ranch hands laughing, and above that sound came the rhythmic thud of a hammer, Eli fixing the gate near the pasture. She watched him through the open door for a long time unseen. He moved with quiet grace for a man so large, the muscles of his arms flexing beneath his rolled sleeves, sweat glinting along his brow. But it wasn't his strength that held her eyes. It was the gentleness in the way he worked, the patience in every motion. Something inside her stirred, deep and undeniable. She pressed a hand to her chest and whispered to herself, "Lord, help me." Because she knew. Somewhere between those long days and quiet nights, she had fallen in love with the giant cowboy who'd given her and her boy a home. That evening, after supper, Eli lingered by the porch while Clara put Samuel to bed. The stars were bright, spilling silver over the land. When she stepped outside, the air was cool, smelling of rain far away. Eli was sitting on the steps, a pipe between his fingers, the glow of its ember lighting the rough angles of his face. She hesitated in the doorway, then joined him, folding her hands in her lap. For a long time they just sat in silence, the kind that didn't need filling. Finally Eli spoke, his voice low and roughened by thought. "I reckon I ain't thanked you proper, Clara." She turned to him surprised. "For what?" "For bringing life back to this place," he said simply. "After my family passed, it was just walls and ghosts. You and the boy, you changed that." His gaze drifted toward the dark horizon. "Used to be I'd sit out here and wish the wind would carry me off, same as it did them. But now?" He paused, drawing a slow breath. "Now I look forward to the mornings again." Her heart ached at the quiet pain in his tone. She knew that kind of grief, the kind that didn't fade, only softened around the edges. "You loved them deeply," she said softly. He nodded once. "My wife, Mary, and our 2 girls. Fever took 'em near 10 years ago. Buried 'em on the hill yonder. Couldn't stand to leave, so I stayed. Figured the ranch was all I had left to keep me from breaking." His voice trembled then, and Clara felt tears rise to her own eyes. Without thinking, she reached out and laid her hand over his. "You've done right by them," she whispered. "This place still breathes because of you." He looked down at their joined hands, and the air between them shifted, charged with something tender and raw. "And you?" he asked quietly. "What keeps you from breaking?" She swallowed hard. "My boy," she said. "And hope, I suppose. The kind that don't make sense but won't die, no matter how you try to bury it." Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat the world held still. Then Eli said softly, "Maybe that's what keeps us both alive, then." From that night on, something changed. It wasn't spoken, not yet, but it was there, an unspoken bond weaving between them, growing stronger with every passing day. Eli would bring her flowers from the field, simple things, wild daisies or sage tied with twine. Samuel began to call him Sir less and Mr. Eli more, and sometimes when the boy laughed too loud or fell asleep by the fire, Eli would lift him with a care that made Clara's throat tighten. One Sunday afternoon after church in town, some of the townsfolk whispered as Clara walked beside Eli down the street. A widow and a rancher, what could they know of propriety? But Eli didn't seem to care. When Samuel slipped his hand into Eli's, the giant cowboy looked down, smiled faintly, and kept walking. For the first time in years, Clara didn't feel ashamed of being seen. Then came the night Samuel fell ill. It started with a fever, sudden and sharp. Clara stayed by his side, cooling his forehead with wet cloths, her heart pounding with dread. Memories of her husband's death clawed their way back, and she prayed until her voice went hoarse. Eli sat outside the room, silent and tense, his hands clenched into fists. When Samuel's breathing grew ragged, Clara broke, sobbing softly. "I can't lose him too, Eli. I can't." That was when Eli came to her side, his hand closing around hers, strong and sure. "You won't," he said fiercely. "Not while I draw breath." He stayed through the night, fetching water, tending the fire, his large frame a steady shadow by the bed. When dawn finally broke and Samuel stirred, whispering "Mama," Clara's tears turned to laughter. She turned toward Eli, and the look in his eyes, raw, full of relief, was one she'd never forget. He reached out then, hesitantly, and brushed a tear from her cheek. "Told you," he said softly. "He's part of you, so he's mine too." In that moment, something in Clara's heart finally gave way. The grief, the fear, the loneliness, all of it cracked open under the weight of his words. She leaned into him, her forehead resting against his chest, and for the first time she let herself cry without shame. Eli held her, his arms wrapping around her small frame, steady as the earth beneath them. Outside, the first light of dawn spilled through the window, touching them both in gold. When Samuel fell back asleep, safe and breathing easy, Eli murmured into her hair, "You ain't alone no more, Clara. Not ever again." And for once, she believed him. After the night of Samuel's fever, something unspoken yet powerful settled between Eli and Clara. The house felt warmer somehow, the silence softer, as if even the walls knew a change had come. Eli no longer kept a careful distance the way he once had. Instead, he moved through the house with quiet ease, his presence no longer something separate but a part of their days. When he returned from the fields, Samuel would run to him shouting, "Mr. Eli," and Eli would lift the boy high, laughing in that rare low sound that shook the air. Clara would watch from the doorway, her hands pressed to her apron, her heart full to bursting. That laughter was a balm she didn't know she'd needed. And every time Eli's gaze found hers afterward, soft, lingering, full of something unsaid, it left her breathless. The weeks turned to months. Summer ripened into the first blush of autumn. The fields turned from gold to amber, the nights cool and full of stars. The ranch hands had taken to calling her Mrs. J, as though she'd always belonged there. Clara took care of them all, cooking hearty meals, mending torn shirts, scolding them gently when they tramped mud through the kitchen. But it was Eli she watched for each evening, the sound of his boots on the porch, the way he'd pause by the doorway before coming in, tipping his hat like he wasn't sure he had the right. She'd begun to see the man beneath the giant, quiet, patient, and gentle in his strength. And he had begun to see her not just as a widow who needed shelter, but as the heart that had brought his home back to life. One crisp morning, Clara went out to hang laundry. The sky was blue and sharp, the wind tugging at her hair. She was humming softly when she heard footsteps behind her. Eli stood there holding a basket she'd left by the barn. "Thought you might need this," he said. "Thank you," she replied, turning to take it. Their hands brushed, and that tiny touch sparked the same electric warmth that had been building for months. She looked up at him, those storm-gray eyes searching hers, the sunlight glinting off his rough jaw. And the world fell away. For a long, suspended moment, neither moved. Then Eli stepped closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "Clara." Her name on his tongue was like a prayer. "Yes," she breathed. He hesitated, as if measuring something sacred, then said, "You don't have to keep thanking me for taking you in. You saved this place as much as I ever did." Her heart stuttered. "I only did what needed doing," she said softly. He shook his head, his gaze deep and steady. "You did more than that. You brought back the sound of laughter. You brought back peace." The wind caught her hair then, tossing a strand across her face. He reached up without thinking and brushed it away, his calloused fingers grazing her cheek. She froze, her breath shallow, her pulse pounding. "Eli," she whispered, and in that one word everything she felt trembled through. Gratitude, longing, fear, and something she could no longer deny. For the first time his expression faltered, uncertainty flickering through the strength. "Tell me to stop," he said quietly, his hand hovering near her face. She didn't. Instead, she closed her eyes, and when he leaned in, his lips brushed hers like a question asked against the wind. The kiss was gentle, hesitant, but it broke something open inside her. For years, she had lived in silence and sorrow. Now warmth rushed through her like sunlight after rain. When they parted, she looked up at him, tears bright in her eyes. "You shouldn't have," she whispered weakly. He smiled faintly, his voice a rough murmur. "Maybe not, but I reckon I needed to." After that day, the world seemed to move differently. Everything carried a new quiet beauty. The way Eli handed her a cup of coffee each morning. The way Samuel laughed when Eli lifted him onto a horse. The way their fingers brushed when they passed each other in the kitchen. Theirs was not a love of grand gestures or sweet words. It was built from shared work, from steady glances across the table, from the understanding that they had both known loss and chosen to keep living anyway.
Yet beneath it all ran a current of longing so strong it frightened her.
Some nights she'd wake to the sound of rain and imagine his arms around her, his heartbeat steady against her ear. And sometimes, when he thought she wasn't looking, she'd catch him watching her with a tenderness that made her knees go weak. Still, Clara worried. The townsfolk had started to talk. A widow and a rancher under the same roof. It was enough to stir whispers in church pews and general stores. She heard the murmurs when she went to town for supplies, felt the sideways glances. Once, a woman from the mercantile muttered just loud enough for her to hear. "Some women waste no time finding a man to feed them." Clara's face burned. But before she could speak, Eli appeared behind her, his towering frame blocking the gossip like a shield. He looked the woman square in the eye and said evenly, "That woman works harder in a day than most do in a week. And if anyone's beholden to anyone, it's me to her." The woman had blanched and turned away, and Clara had stood there, speechless, her heart pounding. On the ride home, she tried to thank him, but Eli only said, "You don't owe shame to small minds, Clara. You hold your head high." As autumn deepened, the ranch grew busy with the fall drive. Men from neighboring spreads came to help round up cattle before the snows. Clara cooked for them all, keeping the house warm and bright. Eli was gone for long hours, returning each night bone-tired. But even then, he'd find her in the kitchen, helping her carry wood, brushing a hand lightly against her back as he passed. One evening, after the cattle had been driven in and the men settled around the fire, Eli came to her quietly. "Step outside a moment," he said. She followed him to the porch, the moon casting silver light over the hills. He stood there for a long time, hat in hand, his expression unreadable. Finally, he said, "Clara, I've been thinking." Her heart thudded painfully. "About what?" He drew in a breath, the air clouding before him. "About what it means to keep a home, to have a family again. About what I want this place to be when the years start catching up." He paused, then turned toward her fully. "I know you've been through sorrow. So have I. But I don't want to let it be all we've known." Her breath caught. The moonlight made his eyes pale and shining. "Eli," she whispered, her voice trembling. He took a step closer. "I ain't a man of fancy words," he said softly. "But I know what I feel. You and that boy, you belong here. And not just as guests. I don't mean to rush what's already been growing between us. But if you'll have me, Clara Jennings, I'd be proud to make you my wife." The world went still. The wind, the stars, the hum of the crickets, all of it fell away. Tears filled her eyes as she searched his face, her heart too full for speech. For a moment, all she could do was reach up and touch his cheek, her voice breaking. "Eli McCall," she whispered, "you saved me when I didn't know I could be saved again." His rough hand covered hers, and in that touch was every promise that mattered. "Then say yes," he said softly. She nodded, her tears turning to a smile. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes." Eli's arms came around her then, solid and sure, lifting her off her feet as the night wind swirled around them. Somewhere inside the house, Samuel stirred, calling softly for her. Eli set her down gently, brushing a thumb against her lips. "Go to him," he murmured. "Tell him the good news come morning." As she went back inside, she turned once more to look at him, the giant cowboy standing beneath the stars, his hat pressed to his chest, his eyes fixed on her like she was the only light that ever mattered.